All right, here we are for our speaker panel, last session of the day, as I mentioned. My name is Vanessa McCracken. I am an ag program manager at the City of Boulder, Open Space and Mountain Parks. We had many good questions earlier that we did not get to, so please put your questions back in the poll EV, and we will get as many as we can answered by our panelists here. So I'm going to begin by thinking about everyone up here today has shared some really incredible progress in things that you have changed. And Lowell and Alejandro, I want to ask you two specifically, were there some things on your operations that didn't go well? I think it's important to talk about some of the challenges in the journey as well. So is there anything you could share that was a hiccup between the sad picture and the happy picture?
Many things went wrong. Now, I think we need to be willing to make mistakes in order to make progress on what we do. Because reality is we're dealing with a very complex system, and it's more like a trial. I mean, we learn by doing. But we have to have the intention to actually make it work. Otherwise, we're just going to say, it doesn't work. But we need to have the mentality of, it's going to work, right? Obviously, I don't think none of us have done it by ourselves. We have to build that community to support us. And yeah, but we all have made a lot of mistakes. One of my biggest mistakes is to be very focused on the soil and forget about the cow. And now the cow is actually driving the whole thing, like when they asked me in Australia, right? So do you leave more grass when it's dry? Is the cow leaving more grass? We don't force the cow anymore. Actually, we just open the gate. We used to drive the whole thing because we thought that everything has to pass through the gate. But no, the cow knows where the calf is. And if the cow is well nurtured, like well fed, then it will remember to go back to that calf.
So we had no failures. We made lots of mistakes. But we learned from what didn't work, and if you learn from what doesn't work, then it's not a failure. Probably the main thing we tried multiple times that have been successful in other areas is to interseed warm season cover crops into cool season perennial grasses. In our hotter western Colorado climate, even though it's irrigated, we have not been successful with that. We tried that numerous different ways, and so we decided that just doesn't work for us. There were a number of others, but just learn from your mistakes, and then it won't be a failure.
Next thing I want to ask, after we had dinner last night where Alejandro and Lowell were able to join us, and one of the things, Alejandro, you mentioned was observation and really looking. So I just want to ask everyone, I have been trying to get better at observation, but every time I leave the field, I'm like, oh, I didn't look at that. Why didn't I notice that thing that I should have looked at? So what are maybe some tips or things to think about when you're on the land, when you're really in that observation phase?
I'm just going to share a story of that, because the father of a good rancher, of a good a friend of mine who's a good rancher, his father took a chair where the cows were. He just sit on the chair. And his friend said, why are you wasting time there? And his answer was, I'm making money. So yeah, it actually relates a lot to the time you spend with boots on the ground on the field.
Put your phone away unless you're using it to take pictures to document what you're observing. Whether I'm running the tractor, when I move my cows every day, it always takes me longer to move them because I spend more time just standing there watching them after they're in their new paddock than what it took to reel up the polywire and give them a new section. So, yeah, I'll just see what's going on, and you'll always, you know, the nice thing about it is, like for us as farmers or ranchers who are doing it every day, we can always look the next day and see what happened. We can try something different, and you see, you know, what's going on, you know, very soon. Whereas if it's someone coming into the farm or consulting every 6 months or a year, it's a little harder to make those small observations.
Well, and here's a story that you might not know about some of the seeds that are in the green cover crop mixes. So Dale used to be their agronomist for years. So we started to notice, you know, sometimes you have dry pastures, but the ditch by the road looks great and it's full of plants, right? You know, and so the cattle are trying to get out and feed in that ditch. So things like cup plant, right? Plants that you wouldn't necessarily think as a pasture plant, or saltbush, the forming saltbush can be one, is to just, that's why those are now in some of these cover crop mixes, is just to look at the ecosystem. It's like, oh, cattle are eating this. This is flourishing even when it's dry. So some of those are things that nobody would have thought of as a cover crop. That's how it got in. It's just like, oh, wow, let's look at what's growing in this ditch that the cattle are trying to get to because the pasture is so overgrazed. It's like to be willing to have your paradigm changed, right? And so we were talking to somebody that had bought new land that was really degraded, and mesquite isn't something that you'd recommend long term, but mesquite is something that cattle can eat, right, in the short term. If it's something that, yeah, you know, that there is nutrition there. So there's certain things, that same thing with the saltbush. There's certain plants that might be okay for this stage of a pasture that you wouldn't want to see 4 years or 5 years later. It's just to open your mind and see what is naturing offering, and to try to use what seems like a problem to turn it into a resource. So, you know, that's why we're thinking about goats on this one set of land, because we have so many things that the cattle can't get around. So we have these overgrown wild raspberry bushes that are just these big patches. So those are wonderful goat food. So you try to turn, when you can, to turn these problems into something that you could make money with, right? And then just open your mind about what could be a plant that you can plant for money, right? Or a plant that you can use as a pasture plant, because we're all experimenting. This is, you know, it's a new world to try to think of, you know, how we think about plants differently.
Okay, this is an audience question, and I'll address it to Alejandro, but Lowell and Elizabeth, especially from the psychology side, maybe you have ideas too. I'm having a hard time reconciling what I've heard today with the recommendation that we eat less beef. Any recommendations?
Can I start? Yes, please. Okay, beef is not beef, okay? And so we know from people that are researching it. What's the guy in Utah that's researching it? You know who I mean, right? No.
Stephen Van Village.
Yeah. Stephen Van Village. Yeah, well, I really massacred it, but there's this fellow in Utah, Van Village, who's, he's looking at meat, and he's trying to look at the ratio of the nutrients of the meat compared to the types of nutrition, right, that the cattle have had. So he started off with grass-finished beef and, you know, store beef, but he found that within the grass-finished beef, there was such an enormous variety in nutrients. And I don't mean like 20% more of something, but like 400% more. And so the diversity and richness and health of the pasture is directly correlated to the quality of the meat. So in humans, we want to have the same amount of omega-3 and omega-6 in our bodies, and the average American has a 1:30 ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. So that's things like seed oils, but it's also cattle that are finished on corn. That's not a natural food for cattle. It makes them fat, but it makes omega-6 fat, right? So we're taking what would have been a healthy meat and making it an unhealthy meat right at the end. So the best of grass-finished meat is like eating salmon. It's very high in omega-3. So therefore, the real recommendation is we all need to be eating food that's naturally high in omega-3 and high in nutrient quality, right? And obviously the cattle, they're only going to have as many nutrients as the plants have, and the plants are only going to have as many nutrients as the soil biology stomach can mine out of the soil and put into the plant. So that's an enormous difference. There's another fellow that's at the University of Wisconsin, and his name will come to me. They have a device that measures the different nutrient qualities in fruits. Yeah, and his name will have to come to me. And that's another thing that initially they thought it would be pretty quick to be more accurate about, right, how much vitamin A is really in broccoli. But they found the same thing, that certain vegetables would have 400 times more nutrients. And you can get a conventionally grown orange with no vitamin C, right? And so the big challenge for us with human nutrition is we have an organic label, but we don't know what the soil health quality is, right? So that's why we have our own greenhouse. We try to eat a lot of our own food, that we grow, just because I know the soil that I'm growing, my vegetables in. So, and we have a small greenhouse for that, because you can get something that's organic, but there's, for example, hydroponics tend to be very low nutrient, right? So we don't know how it's grown. And the worst soil I've ever seen in my life is California. Just awful, terrible depleted soil.
Thank you. Alejandro, any thoughts on eating more beef?
I can eat more beef. No, I mean, that reminds me like the data that we were given about how many bison used to roam North America. 100 million, right? 100 million? Mm-hmm. I don't believe that. I think they come up with this number because they don't want because it's about 100 million, 90 million head of cattle in the US. I think they come up with that number just to limit us. But reality, for example, even if I'm in a very brittle environment, even though I'm in a brittle environment, we should be having, instead of, let's say, 3,000 cows around the area, we could potentially have 10,000 cows. So I think we want to regenerate or make America great again, or grace again. We really need a lot of way more cattle than what we have right now. Because I don't believe that 100 million bison. I think there will be hundreds of millions of bison roaming and keeping everything very healthy.
Eat more beef.
Well, and if you remember the slide that showed that a grassland is the best carbon sink, right? So people think that you should plant more trees to sequester more carbon. But a grassland, a native prairie with a lot of forbs and diversity in it too, in addition to grasses, that's the very best carbon sink. Have you ever seen those pictures that show how far down some of those roots go? Those are roots that can go down 30 feet, and they can infiltrate all the way down into the groundwater level, and they can help refill. That's why we're under the Ogallala Aquifer. They created this whole underwater ocean. And so the best way to make those lands healthier and able to do their carbon sequestration job, right, is like what Alejandro is suggesting, is to put a lot more cattle on it, manage the way that the bison used to go through it, which is very intensive grazing and then rest, right? And then that's going to help us regenerate those grasslands and sequester more carbon. And we can't do that unless all of you commit to eat a lot more beef.
Yeah, and we need to keep in mind that where we are in North America, most of it is grasslands. I mean, we are not like having the conflict, for example, that Brazil or some part of Brazil have, like, how can we raise cattle in the Amazonia? I mean, that's not the place to raise cattle, to be honest with you.
And I would like to say, if people are thinking about eating and the relationship between the environment, people think that eating soy products or avoiding meat is healthy. You can have a completely healthy ecosystem and raise cattle, but you cannot raise soy in a healthy ecosystem. So if you're planting soybeans, you're killing a lot of small mammals, you're getting rid of predator birds, you're changing the insects. Soybeans tend to use the neonicotine pesticides, right? The neonics that are going to kill bees. There's a lot of death involved, even in an organic bean patch, right? So that's kind of this myth that that the vegetarian or vegan is good, and meat is bad, right? So that's just something that I wish more people understood, that you can have a really robustly healthy ecosystem that is teeming with life, as you can see from Alejandro's pictures, and is creating a very healthy food, right? And that's different from a lot of, vegetable products that we have. Not exclusively, right? But a permaculture approach is better.
I think to sum up what we're discussing here, I think it's Diane Rogers that came up with, it's not the cow, it's the how. And it boils down to how the cow is raised and what you're doing with it in improving all these things we're talking about. Or if the cow is penned up in a feedlot, then maybe that is the problem.
Speaking of the cow and the how, has anyone tried virtual fencing?
We have not. We have a 18,000 acre national forest permit that we run on in the summer, and we're interested in it, but because of the terrain, it would be pretty hard to have enough base stations, and we feel like maybe in 5 or 10 years the technology will be developed further, and so it would be maybe a good option. One thing we have noticed, kind of along with this and the observation question, is when we bought our permit, we had to buy the cows that were with that permit, and that rancher in the winter, he had just turned the cows in a big area and fed hay all winter. And then when we bought the cows, we immediately began rotationally grazing them in our fields in very small paddocks and moving them every day, even in the winter. And so right away, when they went up into the forest and were turned loose, they tended to stay in a mob much more than they had before with the previous owner.
Yeah, I have worked with some clients that are using virtual fence, and two things that virtual fence will not solve. I mean, I like virtual fence, and I think it comes to stay. But one thing is, it will not replace a good water distribution system, because it's just a fence. And the second one is, it will not replace the observation. Because some people get too excited about virtual fence, and they start building paddocks, and they say, I'm gonna say 2 people that they don't have to look for the cattle. And when they go there, oh my God, and the cattle are almost dying of hunger, I mean, still you need to be there and say, okay, this is the size, and then you put in the virtual fence. Yeah.
Elizabeth, you mentioned earlier organic certification. Do any of you have thoughts on a regenerative certification?
What's interesting about the regenerative organic certification is that it sadly seems to be taking the same sort of history that organic certification went, which means that there's 4 or 5 different groups all trying to become the one to make the label. And that's what happened with organic certification. And it had to become a federal standard in order to ever be effective. So that's what the history of organic label was. There were different standards state by state, and then different associations had standard, and it didn't become standardized until it was a federal standard. Now everybody has, good concerns about federal labels, I think, because that also implies that, there can be mandates for what that means for regenerative practice. So I think it's something that has a future, because I certainly as a consumer want to know. I grow some of my own food, a fair amount of it, but when I buy food, I have no idea of the actual nutrient quality. So I will remember the name of the researcher that's in Ann Arbor, but that might be where it goes to instead, because if you could hold the sort of pen and point it at an orange or a piece of kale in your store, and it tells you what the nutrient quality is, you don't have to have it labeled, right? Because then you get rid of all the middleman. So that's actually where my hope is, and I'll have to look up his name since I've mentioned him twice.
My dad always said, figures don't lie, but liars figure. And that's kind of what I think about with certification and all these labels and stuff. People can write about anything they want to on a piece of paper, and they'll even sign their name to it.
Yeah, the other challenge that I see in many certifications that I know is that they are driven by companies, right? To add some value to the product. But then sometimes so they create that demand, but we as producers cannot meet that demand. And then they start lowering the standards. So more producers can get into.
Right, and what happened when all the money went into, that was supposed to go to regenerative agriculture under the bill, you know, what was the name of the bill? I forget the bill. Anyway, the bill, you know, there was supposed to be all this money for regenerative agriculture, but we know that companies like, you know, Walmart, General Mills, they got a lot of that money that was designated for regenerative ag. And so one of the projects that I saw was called Climate Friendly Beef. And then they hire somebody to monitor, and they're not even doing rotational grazing. You know, it's really hard to even figure out what the practices are. And so the money then goes to this middleman, you know, ag company that says they're teaching farmers certain things. So that's a bunch of that climate friendly, was that, you know, the money was called, it went into those middle level sort of companies that said they were doing these practices that were really sort of a greenwash. And then they went to some of these very large food companies, right? So that's the concern, is that money will be siphoned off and it doesn't really represent the practice. So that's why my better hope is for, they've already made the device, you know, and they're really carefully studying it, is that if we each own one and we can just point it at the food, we don't need anybody's label, we can see it.
And remember that we still have our senses working. You know, like,
Right.
okay, how do you know your farmer is doing a good job, or rancher? Well, does it feel good? Does it taste good? Does it look good?
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, we still can sense that difference in flavor and everything. I mean.
Yeah, so thanks for bringing out the points that the process isn't perfect yet. We're getting there. But what does give you hope for the future of agriculture? What's something positive that you see?
Well, I think we've been using very conventional practices for thousands of years until now. I feel that until now, we know how to actually reverse the certification, produce a high quality, more clean, more high nutrient food. And then this is not something that we are thinking about it's something that we can demonstrate. So that's really what brings me hope.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So when we look at that map and we see all the desertification, we are in a revolution of how we use land. We're at the beginning of it. And if you look at the data on adoption of things like cover crop and no-till, it's, you know, slow and steady, but we just about 3 years ago started to see exponential change in adoption. So that's really exciting. And, you know, you travel, we travel, you know, there's a lot more. The soils in Europe are a lot worse because they've been tilled for so much longer, but, right, there's all over the world people are interested in regenerating soil. And so all of that enthusiasm and adoption is exciting. What especially gives me hope is to meet so many farmers that are really innovative and creative and trying new things, right? So people that are doing this are often on the forefront of saying, well, why don't we use cup plant in a pasture mix? Or, right, just thinking of new things, or doing lots of different kind of intercropping in new ways that haven't been tried before. It's like the door is open. And so that opens up a lot of creativity. And what I find when we talk with people that are just beginning their journey, one of the things they often say is, this makes farming fun again, right? This makes ranching fun again. Because the most hopeful thing is when a farmer or a rancher sees their own land get better, right? It's mutually, isn't it thrilling? It's so exciting to see it getting better. So there's this, you make more money and you have more fun. Really, you know, what could be better? You know, you save money, you make more money, you have more fun, there's a learning curve. But that to me is really hopeful because it has built-in rewards to it. And people are doing so many cool things, inventing new products, right? You know, these guys have created their own cool new things. People are inventing it as they go.
Lowell?
Well, in our case, just knowing that we're improving the soil and seeing it, you know, standing at the tail water end of our field and watching clear water come out instead of brown water, and knowing that topsoil is leaving the farm, involving our girls on the farm, moving fence. They love helping move the cattle, digging for earthworms. all that. It brings a lot of positive future to in our experience, and to just in our valley, I'm seeing there's a lot of younger farmers who are inspired about taking on new land and farming, where 15 years ago it was a bunch of old farmers, and so it's pretty exciting to see on a very local level young farmers and ranchers being excited about what's happening.
And I think nowadays we're able to pull a lot of very capable, smart people. Because think about what traditionally happened in families. Oh, you're the smart guy, you go to the city. You stay here on the farm. But now we have really a lot of very bright people actually joining this, because it is a win-win for everybody.
So along those lines, Alejandro, there were a couple questions earlier that we didn't get to, and for this as well. Thinking about your twice daily moves on the ranch, can you talk to us a little bit about the labor that's required to do that and how you fulfill those needs?
Yeah, by trying to have just one herd, it simplifies a lot of things, because everything on the ranch gets shut off all the water, so we only care for one herd. Like when I used to go with my dad and try to take a look at the cattle, we spend a whole week riding like 10 hours per day. Then now my dad goes to the ranch, and then in 2 hours we sold the cattle. And then he says, so what are we doing now? Well, whatever you want, we're done. But we try to have it, at the ranch we have a foreman, a cowboy, and they take care for all the horses and cattle and water and everything. And then we have a shepherd for the sheep. So yeah, we always try to keep it very simple and very low cost. So whatever the price is, the commodity price is, we make sure that we're gonna be profitable. Yeah.
Okay. Alejandro, one more ranch-specific question here. How long do you have for your rest periods based on the amount of precipitation a year? Is there, do you have a kind of correlation between precipitation and how long the rest period needs to be?
Yeah, we have become more conservative in our, because we want to stockpile or make more grass, more reserve of grass, because things are getting more rougher now and more erratic. So our ideal right now is 18 months until we go back to the same pasture. Now, obviously, there will be a change on your cows from eating way more green than less green, but that's where you have this great tool, which is selection and culling. You start get rid of all those cows that cannot thrive under those conditions. Yeah, but it's about, it varies actually, depending on the rains, but we prefer to have more grass than we need, yeah.
Okay, Elizabeth, I want to go back to you. I have a couple questions for you. For me, your two talks were very different, and there's not a lot of people that I've heard who can talk both about the psychology and the science. And you even mentioned sort of the segregation of science, at universities. So what can we do about that? How can we get more people talking about both or learning about both?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I came out of ecology and health. So within health, I taught human health, which included emotional health. And I initially thought of that as completely separate from ecosystems, right? But not anymore, because healthy ecosystems make healthy people, and healthy people make healthy ecosystems. So there's a lot of real siloization in science, right? So it's a huge issue, and it takes a lot of individual, it can be very discouraging on a one-on-one case. So at Michigan State, that they don't require soil biology of the plant biology majors, and that means individuals in a meeting saying, no, you have to, and they're like, well, our program is so full already. But it takes persistence. So the thing that gives me the most hope about higher ed and agriculture and food is that they are 4 steps behind, right? So all of the innovation, and I'm a professor, and I'll tell you, my learning comes from me being a farmer, and it doesn't come from the work, that that I teach what I know, but I haven't gotten most of what I've known from universities. I've learned it afterwards, right? I had a foundation to learn it. So that's what gives me hope, is that we know that the presentations at No Till in the Plains, right, are much better, more interesting, richer discussions of regenerative agriculture than you're going to find in the conversations that happen, among the scholars, that they have been left behind, right? And so I think that means that we also have to make the public sphere, right, is to change our mind of what an intellectual is, right? So the people that are writing the books and are teaching you, whether they're Dr. so-and-so or not, that's okay, is that we have to really make use of the insights. And we have, collectively, within regenerative ag. There's all sorts of people that are teaching and learning. And I like that too, because some of our best students, some of the people that have taught me the most are, farmers that don't have any degree. That doesn't matter. They're doing something that's really interesting. So it's a low ego community, and it's nicer than higher ed.
Do you guys have any thoughts about that? I can ask a different question. Let me ask something a little bit different, but sort of on the psychology side too. So for all of you, in your work and in your family, how have you seen working with different generations? Like, do you have different strategies with working with your dad as compared to what you want to pass on to your, obviously it's different than what you want to pass on to your children, but like those generational differences, how do you maneuver those kind of conversations?
Well, regarding my dad, I think I was very lucky because he was very open-minded. Because even though he was from a ranching family, we lost the original ranch, like my granddad, and he went to the bank, and then the bank change is very common. So he asked me just a couple of questions when I started working at the ranch, and I got my mentors. Who are your mentors? Well, this guy and this guy. Oh, I know them. They are honest and hardworking families. Okay, do it. So that was it. And then my dad told me, show me the results. I don't know how you're going to do it, but he's so excited. The same way that we mentioned here, let everybody get involved. The kids need to get involved, everybody get involved. Though I have seen more adoption on younger people than older people. Yeah.
So in my case, that was fairly simple because I moved to Colorado as I grew up farming with my dad in Pennsylvania, and we sold out there when I moved, and I started a new farming operation in Colorado with my brother. And when we decided to try some of these practices, my brother was very skeptical, but he was willing to go along with it, and he was financially set better to take risk than I was at that time. So I had the risk-taking component, and he had the financial ability to take that risk, and so it was a good combination, and we worked well together on it. So we are of the same generation, though.
Well, it's interesting, in my family, it's gone across generations in different ways. So I have a nephew who got a degree in engineering, and he decided that he wanted to be a regenerative farmer. We brought him a couple years ago, he's that redheaded kid that we brought to Regenerative Next with a big conference, and he was thrilled. He's like, I feel like I'm meeting superstars all day long, and he was really jazzed. He's like, 24 years old, and that's what he wants to do. Real smart kid. And then my uncle, his grandfather, he's brought him then along, to other conferences, and his grandfather couldn't be more proud. So in my uncle's generation, he was a contractor, because there was this sense that, if you want to make real money, you get off the farm, but he was always an excellent farmer, and he was very good at tax returns. He would hold a party so that they could all agree that they had hail, or they had all had soil erosion, so that all the farmers in the community would have the same deductions. They're like, if we all say we had hail, they won't deny it. So, he was probably more innovative on the financial end than he was on the agronomic end, but now he's very proud to have that nephew. And from, my husband's father was initially one of those people that thought tillage was what no-till was for lazy people, but then just taking him around to see different fields, he caught on, and then he became one of the biggest advocates and he started to call the people that were still doing tillage the tillage idiots. Yeah, so it's in my family, it's come from, you know, my kids' generation and my generation, but then it's gone back up, you know, to the grandfathers. A lot of them have gotten on board.
Okay, we only have a couple minutes left, so we're going to do a little bit of a speed round, okay? These are very quick answers, okay? Don't overthink any of it. Should be easy. Okay, Lowell, most influential, these are for everybody, most influential mentor.
Gabe Brown. He was the one that I went to the first conference and like, oh wow, how do we do it? And he's like, I don't know how you can do it in Western Colorado with furrow irrigation, but the principles work. You go home and figure it out.
Jesus Almeida. He not only became my mentor, but a friend of mine. Yeah, he's very community driven. It's kind of, yeah, so.
Yeah, so for me it would be Fred Provenza and then my husband, Dale Strickler, you know, they're both very patient and really have interesting creative minds.
Favorite plant?
Gamma grass.
Alejandro?
A perennial grass.
Cereal rye.
Favorite source of information for regenerative ag focused?
YouTube University.
No-Till Farmer magazine probably was my favorite, along with Stockman, Grassman, Grass Farmer and Acres magazine are all right there in the top 3.
They took mine. Yeah, but I think it's also fun to sometimes follow like new small accounts, you know, that YouTube can have people doing really interesting things.
Favorite quote?
Don't pray for rain if you don't know what to do with it.
Mine is a Margaret Mead, never underestimate the power of a handful of people to change the world. Indeed, that's all that ever does.
We can move on.
The favorite one that I like to use on a negative, or how would I say it, with conventional farmers is, it is what it is, in a sarcastic way. That's their go-to for every reason it won't work for them. Well, it is what it is, but in regenerative, I don't have any that comes right up.
It isn't what it is.
Okay, last one. Can you sum up today in one word?
Fantastic.
Inspiring.
Wow.